¿Qué tal? ¿Cómo están? Bienvenidas, bienvenidos a esta noche documental, esta noche donde vamos a presentar un documental que produce Vox, una agencia noticiosa que últimamente se ha dedicado mucho a hacer productos pues de divulgación, en este caso divulgación científica. El documental que vamos a ver se llama Falso Positivo y nos muestra algo de lo que hemos estado hablando pues prácticamente en la última década, que tiene que ver con el uso inadecuado de ciencias forenses, de técnicas de investigación forense, como el análisis de mordidas, como el análisis de manchas de sangre, como la dactiloscopía, como la supuesta balística forense y todas las fallas que existen alrededor de esto. Brent, when did you start realizing there was this big problem with this forensic techniques that were using by the police? Le pregunto que cuando él se dio cuenta en su carrera que todas estas técnicas que acabo de mencionar eran problemáticas.
Well, the problem for me started when I was in undergraduate school, when I was getting my bachelor's degree.
El problema para mí cuando empecé a dar cuenta fue cuando yo estaba haciendo precisamente mis estudios universitarios.
Because I kept encountering police officers teaching classes on forensic science, not actual scientists.
Porque lo que me daba cuenta es que mis maestros, en lugar de ser científicos, eran policías.
And they were all trying to convince us that polygraphs were scientific, even though the scientific literature about that basically discredited it completely.
Y que bueno, lo que nos dábamos cuenta es que muchas de estas técnicas pues no eran científicas, que estaban desacreditadas desde hace mucho tiempo.
But then, and that was bad enough. And then when I went to graduate school in forensic science, they brought in a person from the crime lab, another police officer, to teach us about fingerprinting. And it was ridiculous. I mean, the things he was saying were just lacked any credibility. Could not explain himself at all. It was all over the place.
Pero creo que uno de los momentos importantes fue cuando nos llevaron un policía que nos llevó a explicarnos cómo funcionaban las huellas dactilares o la investigación con huellas dactilares, y fue ridículo. Él prácticamente no tenía un entendimiento científico de esto.
But I think I was able to realize that because, one, I wasn't aspiring to be in the law enforcement community per se. And then also I was reading other literature.
Y bueno, creo que dice él que lo que creo que me ayudó mucho es que yo no tenía la aspiración de participar con policías y que me di a la tarea de revisar la documentación para poderme dar cuenta de esta que es una realidad que es muy importante que empecemos a reconocer.
But it really wasn't an attitude or a belief. It was just more of you're a scientist, you're supposed to find the foundation of these things and show them, learn the proofs so that you can explain them to other people and use good methodology. And when that's non-existent, you realize it's fraudulent.
Y esto es lo que empieza a pasar cuando eres un estudiante de criminología, de ciencias forenses o cualquiera de estas áreas. Empiezas a preguntarte, oye, ¿y será que realmente, bueno, cuando quiere explicar estas cosas debe de haber un fundamento científico? Y si vas y revisas realmente, te vas a dar cuenta de todos los problemas que vamos a ver en este documental.
But I guess I realized it was a real problem in graduate school when I would ask questions and the response wasn't educated or giving me more literature or talking about it. The response was anger. Like, hey, who the hell do you think you are? Things like that in open class from the professors.
Y una forma en la que en lo que me empecé a dar cuenta que era problemático, pues esto, que cuando cuestionabas la validez de estas técnicas, la respuesta siempre era a la defensiva, siempre tenía que ver con tú que te crees, ¿por qué estás cuestionando esto? En lugar de dar argumentos. Valeria también estudió criminalística y criminología. ¿Cuál fue tu experiencia, ahora que vamos a ver este documental y vamos a hablar de estas técnicas, en la enseñanza que te dieron como criminóloga y como criminalista con respecto a este tipo de supuestas técnicas forenses?
También siempre se manejó desde un aspecto en que eran infalibles, ¿no? Que eran totalmente confiables, o sea, nunca nos manejaron, y esto sucedió años después, ¿no? Y no por algún experto o experta que haya impartido clases, sino por el propio desempeño profesional. Yo, por ejemplo, o sea, así te lo venden tal cual, ¿no? Y creo que tiene que ver un poco con lo que ya hemos referido en otros foros, que habla de el efecto CSI,
claro,
cómo termina contaminando lo que los propios docentes creen que es ciencia. De hecho, parte de la dactiloscopía te la venden como ciencia, un primer problema, ¿no?
¿De la qué?
La dactiloscopía te la venden como ciencia.
La dactiloscopía te dicen que es una ciencia.
Ajá. Y bueno, en realidad, pues siempre es el mismo discurso, ¿no? De que ninguna huella es igual a otra, nunca te hablan, por ejemplo, de investigaciones reales, quienes enseñan son peritos de fiscalía, por ejemplo, ¿no? Pero algo interesante y que también es cuestionable es la formación de perito, ¿no? Como quién imparte estas materias. A mí me tocó, por ejemplo, algunos expertos que tenían ingenierías en química, policías, abogados, que después se consideraban peritos porque terminaban ejerciendo un puesto de perito en fiscalía, sí. ¿No? Pero vamos, no, la propia capacitación que ellos recibían era de la fiscalía, claro, en estos términos de investigación y técnicas de identificación. Entonces realmente pues no se nos postula de una manera científica y confiable cuál puede ser la aproximación sobre estos aspectos metodológicos, estadísticos, científicos que debería tener, y sobre todo no se nos habla de márgenes de error y tasas de confiabilidad.
Bueno, vamos a ver este documental y lo vamos a ver completo con ustedes y luego lo vamos a comentar al final. Compartan este video para que más criminólogos, más criminólogas, más criminalistas vean este documental que nos parece, y sobre todo nos da mucho gusto. Ya desde hace tiempo se ha estado poniendo lo pueden encontrar en Netflix, en el documental de Proyecto Inocencia, lo pueden encontrar en diferentes medios de comunicación masivos. Se está hablando precisamente de las limitaciones de las ciencias forenses. Normalmente no se suele hacer de esta forma, normalmente no se suele hablar de estos temas, entonces invitamos a todos y todas que compartan este video para que sus amigos, amigas, colegas, compañeros nos acompañen a ver este documental que lo hemos encontrado, que es de Vox, que nosotros lo utilizamos mucho para nuestras clases de maestría, y es un documental donde nos muestran un caso en particular en donde se utilizaron cabellos para poder supuestamente establecer la culpabilidad de una persona, y a partir de ello se empieza a hablar de todas las limitaciones que existen en las ciencias forenses. Vamos a revisarlo.
do this.
He thought they would eliminate Stinson as a suspect, but that's not what happened. Johnson looked into Stinson's mouth for 20 seconds, the same amount of time it takes to read this. And then Johnson said Stinson's teeth matched a sketch that he and a police artist had made, a sketch of what the suspect's teeth would look like based on the bite marks. Nobody brought the drawing to the hearing, but Johnson said, "It resembles what I see here. Stinson's mouth," he said, "certainly is consistent with what I drew. It is remarkable." And that was enough for the court to order a full dental examination. But if they'd had the sketch in the room, they would have seen that it said the suspect would be missing a lateral incisor. Stinson was missing a central incisor, his right front tooth. But now the dentist was on the record saying that they matched. The field of bite mark analysis is one of the so-called pattern matching disciplines in forensic science. Fingerprints are the best known example, but the group also includes shoe prints, tire treads, handwriting, and bullet casings. We call them forensic sciences, but they developed independently of what we typically think of as the science world. The universities and research hospitals, peer-reviewed journals, grant funding organizations, those institutions of basic research have fed some forensic fields, but many others lack that foundation.
You get up the street to the University of Wisconsin and you look for the Department of Fingerprints or the Department of Shoe Impressions. It's not there.
That's because these fields developed mostly in response to crime scenes and the obligation to study whatever bits of information they contained. The examiners look at samples closely and make a subjective assessment of how similar they are.
You know, it's funny, when people watch CSI or think about forensic science, they often think that it's very high-tech and glossy and perfect and often automated. And in the real world, the pattern identification sciences do not work like that. It's not that subjectivity makes it illegitimate or necessarily incorrect, but we ought to know something about how accurate it is.
We ought to know something about how accurate it is. For the criminal justice system, this is still a new idea. So at the time of Stinson's case, nobody knew how accurate or inaccurate bite mark analysis was. The man who examined Stinson's teeth, L.T. Johnson, is a forensic odontologist, and bite mark evidence is just part of what they do.
When we have tragedies, plane crashes, or other kinds of terrible events, sometimes we use teeth that are found to help identify human remains, and that's an important tool, and I believe quite an accurate one.
Rescue workers were there quickly, but they quickly learned that there was no one to rescue.
The same year he worked on Stinson's case, Johnson led a team identifying victims of a plane crash that killed 31 people. He would go on to help identify 11 decomposing victims found in serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment. Forensic odontology had been an established field for decades, but it was only in the 1970s that they decided to go beyond identifying victims by their teeth and started identifying suspects by bite marks. It began with a 1975 case, People versus Marks in California. Edgar Marks was accused of murdering his landlady and leaving a bite mark in the cartilage of her nose. The bite mark evidence was deemed admissible, even though the appeals court conceded that there was no established science behind it.
And it became the germinal case because all of the precedent establishing cases in high courts across the country cited back to Marks. Fast forward a few more years, Ted Bundy goes on trial, and there's bite mark evidence in the Ted Bundy case, and it made movie stars out of a couple of forensic dentists. And bite mark evidence took off.
This norm of precedent of conforming to past decisions, it exists for a reason, but it happens to be the opposite of how science works.
Precedent is really important in the judicial system. We want constancy, predictability, and we have a rule that like cases should be decided the same way.
Science, by contrast, is inevitably and unavoidably always contingent, progressing, growing, changing, shifting as new research tells us new things and corrects past misunderstandings. The legal system's not really designed to adapt to that.
So a game of judicial telephone convinced the courts that bite mark identification was an accepted area of science, when in fact, it had never been tested.
There's no science that we have seen to support that. It's really quite astonishing. It's the one thing that gets me truly agitated, is because there's just no science to support it.
A month after Johnson collected models and photographs of Stinson's teeth, he came back with his final conclusion. The teeth of Robert Lee Stinson would be expected to produce bite patterns identical to those which I examined in this extensive and exhaustive analysis. He said the evidence was overwhelming. The sketch Johnson referenced at the prior hearing, it was never mentioned again.
He was showing me, you take this overlay of the pictures of his teeth and you put it on the pictures of the bite wounds on Mrs. Saichaz's body, and you kind of see how they align. And he did the same thing with the models, but I wasn't completely convinced that I could convince a jury based on what Dr. Johnson did that Mr. Stinson was guilty of an offense like this. I said, we need a second opinion on this case.
Johnson recommended Raymond Rawson, who was known as one of the leaders in the field. So the detectives flew to Las Vegas to deliver the evidence, and they reported that Rawson gave a verbal confirmation of Johnson's finding, but he didn't spend much time on it. According to a memo book that one of the detectives kept and later published, Rawson met them at their hotel room at the Four Queens, took a look at the x-rays and the molds, and said that was good enough for him. 5 days later, Robert Lee Stinson was arrested at his home.
And we decided that, given a brutal, horrific crime like this, we now have two witnesses who are saying it's him. And matched against that is what? My gut level feeling. And so we issued the charge.
The U.S. has an adversarial judicial system where the judge presides over a trial but isn't responsible for uncovering the truth. Instead, it's up to the opposing lawyers to present evidence and witnesses that support their version of events.
And ultimately, the theory is, of course, that through this conflict of ideas and interpretations, the truth will emerge.
But from the start, Stinson could tell he wasn't entering a fair fight. He prepared a letter asking for a replacement for his lawyer, who only took his case 2 weeks before trial. "Your Honor, I'm facing life for something I did not commit," he wrote. The judge denied his request, which came in the middle of the trial, and she also denied his lawyer's motion to exclude the bite mark evidence. She said there are adequate standards and controls in the area of forensic odontology. It is a recognized area of science.
Frankly, at the time, it was not a close decision for me. Even though it was unique testimony, I didn't have anything in front of me that indicated that it was not reliable, and it certainly was helpful to the jury, I think, and relevant to the issues, and so I admitted the evidence.
At the time, Wisconsin only required that forensic testimony be relevant and helpful to the jury. Judges weren't required to assess its reliability.
You have an older woman who's been raped and murdered. We've got an expert who's saying we know who did it. If the judge had excluded that evidence, he would have gone free. And it would have been a legal stretch for her to do that, given the state of the law and the precedent at the time.
As the appeals court would point out in a footnote, by the time of Stinson's trial, bite mark evidence had been accepted in 19 jurisdictions and rejected by none. The court in Stinson's case was no different, and the bite mark evidence went before the jury. The first thing that happens when forensic experts take the stand is that they're prompted to list their credentials to show that they're qualified.
That makes sense from a certain perspective, but there's also a danger that the jury misunderstands the power of that experience.
Dr. Johnson seemed to make sense to me when he testified. He certainly was qualified, being a professor at the university in the dental school.
Here you have this very learned dentist who has no reason to lie, who comes in and tells you this is rock solid science. How's the jury to decide he must be wrong? That's extremely compelling.
Dr. L.T. Johnson walked the jury through the evidence. He even brought models of Stinson's lower teeth and one of the bite marks so he could show how they matched. He concluded his testimony by saying that the bite marks would have to have been made by Robert Lee Stinson. The second dentist, Raymond Rawson, testified that there was no question that there was a match to a reasonable scientific certainty. Stinson's lawyer did try to get a defense expert of his own, but that expert was never called to counter the prosecution's dentists in court, because after he examined the evidence, he agreed with them. Instead of two sides battling it out before the jury, there was one side with two experts making false statements about the science, and one side with no experts at all. During Stinson's trial, the prosecution and defense would ask the two bite mark experts a combined 240 questions, but they didn't ask the most important one.
The real question that we should be asking is, what is the evidence that shows us that people in this field reach accurate results? It's not rocket science.
Forensic scientists can have protocols and guidelines, use well-accepted tools and technology, but we won't know if their methods are actually reliable until we have what's called an error rate study. You take a bunch of bite mark examiners, give them samples of bite marks, and measure how often they make a correct identification. To this day, nobody has ever conducted a proper error rate study for bite mark analysis.
And there's really no incentive to do any research because courts admit it. If courts stopped admitting it, they would do the research, right? Because they want it to be introduced at trial.
Studies that have been done with human cadavers show that there's a lot of distortion when bite marks are made in skin, even in a laboratory setting. The same set of teeth will make marks of different sizes and shapes depending on the skin type, the amount of force, and the orientation of the bite. Missing teeth can look like they're there. Teeth that are there can look like they're missing. One study conducted by forensic dentists found an unsatisfactory level of agreement among examiners on whether a given injury was even a human bite mark. But during Stinson's trial, Dr. Johnson told the jury that there was no margin for error in this case. And then Stinson took the stand. He said he was at a party until about 12:30, went home, and then later went back out to go to the store with a friend. He said as they walked behind his house, he heard footsteps and shushing coming from the back of the alley. But when Stinson first spoke to the police 3 days after the murder, he had only told them that he went home after the party and went to bed. As the prosecutor pointed out at the trial, he had changed his story.
It's my experience that the jury looks a lot at those alibis, and if somebody's lying for no other reason than perhaps trying to get out of something, that is pretty heavy evidence.
After a 3-day trial and less than 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found Stinson guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. On appeal, Stinson challenged the admissibility of the expert testimony in his trial, but the Wisconsin Court of Appeals affirmed his conviction. They were impressed by the dentist's elaborate methods.
Dr. Johnson used an acrylic ring, special three-dimensional indentation technique, 75 individual tooth marks.
They actually claimed the reliability of the bite mark evidence in this case was sufficient to exclude to a moral certainty every reasonable hypothesis of innocence.
It's so absurd. Tarot card readers have a very complex, ancient methodology. It doesn't mean that they can tell your fortune.
And with that ruling, Stinson became the precedent-setting case for bite mark evidence in Wisconsin. 7 years later, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a decision, the Daubert ruling, which should have changed the entire landscape for forensic science. It said that trial judges must assess whether expert testimony is based on reasoning or methodology that is scientifically valid.
Daubert talks about reliability, validity, empirical data, error rates, peer review, is all the good stuff. And scientists would look at it and feel their hearts would patter. They'd be cheered because it says all the right words. But the problem is, it also says it's a flexible standard.
The Daubert ruling gave judges a new gatekeeping role, but at the same time, it said that vigorous cross-examination and presentation of contrary evidence are still an appropriate means of attacking shaky but admissible evidence. So even though judges are supposed to evaluate expert testimony, they can still choose to offload that responsibility.
They don't want to be responsible for letting the killer go free because they excluded the evidence.
After all, the system has always relied on the attorneys to cross-examine witnesses they disagree with and present contrary evidence.
Public defenders are by and large overwhelmed and often don't have the funding to hire their own independent experts, but they shouldn't have to. We shouldn't have to be defending against unreliable scientific evidence.
And ultimately, it's up to the jury to decide what they believe.
I mean, the instructions are very clear that the jury does not have to give any further weight to an expert than any other witness. What kind of weight they want to give to them is totally up to them.
But the jury doesn't have basic information about the error rates of forensic methods like bite mark analysis. Those studies don't exist, in part because judges have never required them.
I don't think there's evil intent anywhere in this circle. It's a collection of institutional participants, sometimes taking the easy way out.
Nothing is suitable in our existing system for making the scientific determination that this evidence is questionable, and here's what juries and judges ought to know about it. It's not happening.
As Robert Lee Stinson began his life sentence, the evidence in the case was boxed up and locked away. That included the blue pullover shirt the victim was wearing when she was killed. It was a crucial piece of evidence, but nobody knew that yet. And it would be 24 years before the true killer was found.
Think about what you were doing between the years 1985 and 2009. All those years you spent getting your education, building a resume.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Getting married, buying a home.
The Hubble Space Telescope is released.
Having children.
Can you explain what internet is?
Building up retirement.
Stinson not guilty of the crime of
watching your children grow up. Funerals of your family members and your loved ones. I mean, it's just an enormous amount of time. You come out and how are you supposed to explain, well, I was convicted of murder, but I didn't do it. That baggage stays with you forever.
Robert Lee Stinson refused to admit guilt, so he was never granted parole. By 2003, he'd been in prison for 18 years. That's when he wrote to the Innocence Project at the University of Wisconsin.
It was a request for assistance, saying that he was innocent and that he was convicted on bite mark evidence.
They took the bite mark evidence out of storage and sent it to 4 forensic odontologists to review. And they found that the dentists who testified against Stinson, L.T. Johnson and Raymond Rawson, had made a series of errors that resulted in an incorrect determination. They said Johnson's technique of placing a semi-opaque overlay on top of the bite marks obscured the fact that they didn't match. And they showed how misleading it could be to hold a dental model up to a bite mark impression, which Johnson had done in front of the jury. It makes it look like Stinson's teeth fit, but it also looks like these 3 random sets of teeth fit too. Overall, they concluded that Stinson can be excluded from having made the bite marks.
We said, look, it's not him. And the prosecutors looked at it and they said, oh, we got to talk to Dr. Johnson. And they came back and they said, no, we stand by it. It's him. Where? How can you see that? But they did.
Fortunately, the bite marks weren't the only physical evidence in the case anymore. The same day Stinson was convicted, December 12, 1985, a paper was published in the journal Nature, reporting that DNA could be used in forensics.
It is evidence that promises a breakthrough future for law enforcement officials.
These genetic fingerprints are a powerful new tool for solving mysterious crimes.
We know today that DNA is a powerful form of evidence, but it's worth digging into why that is. In our cells, there's a small section where a short DNA phrase gets repeated several times. We all have it in the same location, but the number of repeats varies between people. I might have 9, you might have 15. We have instruments that can essentially count the repeats by their size. And because we can count them, we can survey a bunch of people to see how common each number is. So let's say police find a DNA sample with 9 repeats. Well, if 30% of people have 9 repeats, that's not very strong evidence. But scientists have identified more than 13 different locations on our DNA where we vary in these kinds of repeats. And we have 2 numbers for each location because we inherit one from each parent. So maybe I have 9, 9 at one location, 14, 16 at another, 12, 10 at a third, and so on. The more locations you add, the smaller the number of people who could match. That's what makes DNA so powerful. Our samples are unique, they distinguish us from each other, but it's also quantifiable, so we can calculate how much it distinguishes us. It comes with statistics. Compare that to fingerprints. We suspect that they're quite unique, but we can't calculate how unique because fingerprints lack the kind of universal structure that the DNA molecule has. Instead of looking at a predetermined location and counting up repeats, fingerprint examiners have to decide what's notable about each print.
And there are so many different permutations. So that makes it very difficult to say this particular configuration is, 1 in a million or 1 in a quadrillion or whatever, the way you could do with DNA.
Researchers have started figuring out what to measure in a fingerprint to get useful statistics, but the other pattern matching disciplines are further behind. And with bite marks, it might not even be worth trying. In 2010, the federal government gave L.T. Johnson a $700,000 research grant to make bite mark analysis more scientific using statistics. His team borrowed live pigs and made bite marks in their skin with dental models. They used software to measure the bite marks for tooth width, angle, and spacing. And when those measurements were used to guess the source teeth, they identified the correct dental model only 2% of the time. Even in these controlled conditions, skin did not reliably record the dimensions of teeth. But that was already becoming painfully clear.
Wrongfully
Wrongfully convicted of rape.
He spent more than 10 years in prison before
DNA evidence identified the real killer.
the science in this case was just plain wrong.
Bite mark analysis is now being questioned nationwide.
As DNA testing began overturning bite mark convictions around the country, the Wisconsin Crime Lab was analyzing the bra and shirt that the victim in Stinson's case was wearing when she was killed. The male DNA they found on several areas of her clothing didn't match Stinson's DNA. He was excluded as the source again and again and again. By 2008, a full DNA profile was developed from the blue V-neck pullover and entered into a DNA databank. 2 more years would pass before it yielded a match, but in the meantime, the district attorney's office finally agreed that Stinson's conviction should be vacated, and he was released from prison on January 30th, 2009.
I remember the scene of when we walked him out. There was media there.
It was an emotional day for Robert Stinson and his entire family.
It was very powerful when we saw Robert Lee Stinson walk out of this prison this morning.
And we stood outside the prison gates, and they opened up a sliding chain link gate. And it was actually a rather subdued, almost melancholy moment where his sister greeted him with a deep hug. Finally, justice is done, but at what cost?
I can't explain it. I can't explain this. Been a long ride for me, and I'm finally out, and I'm enjoying my life now.
I think the lesson we have, and this is, I think, regrettable, is that no matter how careful you are, how cautious you are, how objective you think you are in these cases, you can still be wrong.
I felt bad. All I can say is, to this case, and I think it's the only wrongful conviction that I know of that I presided over. I'm just grateful we don't have a death penalty.
The year that Stinson was exonerated, the National Academy of Sciences released a report that rocked the field of forensic science.
That report was big. It had huge ripple effects throughout the community.
What it did was really to explode the problem and to say to the world, we have a serious issue here.
It found that no scientific studies supported bite mark identification. And the problem was bigger than that. It said a number of forensic science disciplines were lacking basic research.
It mostly said you need more science in forensic science. Unfortunately, it was received somewhat defensively by the forensic science community, and I think that slowed down our ability to respond to it, to learn from it, to grow from it.
The report recommended the creation of a new federal agency to direct and fund forensic science research and serve as a scientific authority for the criminal justice system.
And so when you come into court, there would be a Bible of this information, and the prosecutors would have to work with that, and defense attorneys would have it available to them, and juries would be instructed accordingly.
But Congress never created the new agency. And by 2016, an Obama administration report found that there were still few studies that were appropriately designed to assess validity. Only the fingerprints in firearms fields had begun to properly measure how accurate their examiners are. Academic researchers haven't really taken an interest in running these studies, and even if they did, they'd need access to forensic examiners and lots of test samples. And in the crime labs, they don't necessarily have the resources or incentives to participate.
You don't have to talk to very many lab directors to find out that they are overburdened and they're undermanned. You don't really have the freedom to say, hey, I think I'll take a third of my people and conduct some error rate studies.
Our problem now is just trying to get the studies done.
Without some permanent infrastructure to continually examine the accuracy of the forensic sciences, we can't be sure that a case like Robert Lee Stinson's won't happen again.
The detectives that picked you up yesterday, did they tell you what this is about, that you're here about a homicide? Do you know what DNA is?
A year after Stinson's release, the DNA from the victim's blue V-neck pullover finally solved the crime.
They got a cold hit. That is, they weren't looking for anybody in particular. They just ran the profile through the database and it hit.
His name was Moses Price Jr., and he wasn't a suspect in the original police investigation. Around the time that Stinson was arrested, Price pled guilty to 2 armed robbery charges. He'd also been accused of rape. And in 1991, as Stinson sat in prison, Price beat a man to death and set his house on fire.
Your DNA wasn't taken until just recently, and it matched to DNA on her body. And I'm hoping that you'll explain what happened here.
When the DNA match prompted police to question him, Price confessed. He said he remembered following a woman one night in November 1984. He was drinking and said he blacked out. Price said if he'd known Stinson had been convicted for the murder, he would have stepped up a long time ago.
You've never heard that anyone had been arrested on it. He spent, since 1985 in prison. What would you want to say to him, Moses?
So?
Some thoughts, Brent?
Well, that was horrifying.
estuvo feo, ¿no?
Here's the thing. This is not a uniquely American problem.
Esto es importante. Este no es un problema únicamente de Estados Unidos.
And really what you see is the washing of hands of all the bureaucrats who are involved in this forensic process.
Sí, lo que estás viendo, y esto es bien importante, es cómo se están lavando las manos todos los burócratas y todos los jueces, la juez y todos los que estuvieron involucrados en este caso.
It's truly the evil of bureaucracy.
Esta es un poco la maldad, la verdadera maldad de la burocracia.
But the real problem that we are seeing over and over again is, even in this documentary, they're underplaying how bad the issue really is.
Sí, y esto es importante. Incluso este documental que trata de echar luz sobre el problema, lo que hacen es un poco tratar de bajarle a la gravedad del problema.
Bad forensic science, fraudulent forensic science represents structural violence against the most vulnerable groups.
La violencia que implica estas malas prácticas se va directamente contra grupos vulnerables. En el caso, por ejemplo, que veíamos en este documental, nos hablaban no solamente de temas relacionados con las marcas de dientes, veíamos también hay todo un tema con los cabellos, hay todo un tema con muchísimos problemas más.
But also, I want to make this very clear. I believe firmly that any forensic professional who gives false testimony or negligent testimony should be sued in civil court, just like a doctor.
Yo creo, y esto es muy importante, que todo aquel forense que participe y dé falso testimonio en la corte debería ser demandado de manera civil precisamente por las víctimas.
That's how we know they're not real scientists, because they have the qualified immunity of the state. If they were a real scientist, there'd be transparency and they'd be held accountable for that kind of misconduct.
El tema es que todos debemos de ser responsables de lo que vamos y hacemos en juicio, de las cosas que estamos diciendo. Es por eso que sabemos que esto va a seguir con impunidad, porque precisamente lo que son llamados peritos oficiales difícilmente son expuestos a este tipo de críticas.
But here's the other part of the justice system that I don't think people fully understand.
Y esta es otra parte que creo que la gente se pierde cuando pensamos en el sistema de justicia.
Attorneys in court are not giving evidence, they are making arguments.
Los abogados en la corte están litigando, están discutiendo, no están dando evidencia.
And these are not people in poverty or vulnerable groups. These are attorneys. These are privileged people who have, they have money and they have cars and they have families. They don't even know what it's like to suffer the way the people that they're prosecuting or defending are.
Y los abogados profesionales en general que están alrededor de este caso no son personas en estado de vulnerabilidad. Son gente que tienen agencia, que tienen dinero, que tienen familia, y que no tienen ni idea de la vida que llevan estas personas precisamente que son convictas por crímenes que no cometieron.
And for too many of these attorneys, going into court and lying their asses off all the time and hiding evidence is an exercise in debate. It's like they're in debate club in fucking high school still. It's childish.
Y la forma en la que se practica muchas veces la abogacía es ir a discutir nada más, a meter ideas que a veces son mentira, y lo ven como si ese fuera su trabajo. Es una actitud muy infantil con lo que respecta a toda la responsabilidad ética de hacer este trabajo.
When I'm under the stand and I'm under oath, I give a finding that's under penalty of perjury. I'm the only one who's under oath. The judge isn't under oath, and the attorneys are on oath. They can all say things that aren't true without any backing whatsoever. When I talk, it has to be firmly backed up by the scientific evidence.
Y esto no se nos olvide, cuando somos forenses, cuando participamos en el área forense, lo que nosotros estamos haciendo es dando nuestro testimonio experto. Y si nosotros mentimos, si nosotros no representamos bien lo que hicimos, nosotros al estar bajo juramento, pues tenemos consecuencias legales por hacerlo.
The problem is impunity, the lack of consequence for overt and constant negligence or falsification of the evidence.
Entonces, en resumen, el problema es la impunidad, precisamente que se hace esto una y otra vez y no hay consecuencias para nadie. What do you think, Valeria?
Sí. Bueno, tiene que ver también con un claro sesgo racial, ¿no?
Claro.
Ya la misma Academia Nacional de Ciencias había mencionado al respecto que varios casos donde se había empleado evidencia forense distinta al ADN, o sea, estamos hablando de huellas dactilares, de cabellos, de fibras, balística y demás, un gran porcentaje de estas condenas erróneas, ¿no?, donde utilizaron este tipo de evidencia, era en contra de comunidades latinas y afrodescendientes. Es decir, se está utilizando esta prueba forense fraudulenta con mayor razón en casos que involucran poblaciones en situación de vulnerabilidad. Y el problema es precisamente ese, que no hay una responsabilidad, no hay incluso, o sea, tendría que realizarse una auditoría de todos los casos en donde estos expertos forenses han participado, porque luego el problema es que evidentemente puede ser que en uno de los juicios no se considere, nosotros acabamos de participar en un juicio tal cual, ¿no?, en donde un tipo de evidencia forense con nada de fundamento científico trató de introducirse y el perito sigue trabajando como forense en una institución oficial, a pesar de que esta prueba forense fue desacreditada en el propio juicio. Entonces, pues, ¿cuántos casos hay en donde esta participación de forenses es, incluso lo señalan en un caso, ¿no? Incluso tienen antecedentes de haber cometido este tipo de conductas fraudulentas y criminales también, y siguen siendo llamados a testificar en otros casos? Son las mismas instituciones, pues. Esto no solamente es problemático por la propia falta de ciencia en las ciencias forenses, sino ahora la introducción de la tecnología que está tratando de suplir como todo este tema de la falta de ciencia, ¿no? Ya lo hemos visto con escáneres, ¿no?, de las escenas del crimen, que es más bien un teatro, pues, es parte de una simulación.
Láseres para balística.
Láser, sí, o sea, es toda una serie de pruebas que realmente evidencian la falta de capacidad técnica de los forenses, que también, bueno, se asocia a otros fenómenos. O sea, como bien dice el doctor Brent, menciona respecto a la falta de capacidad de los defensores, de los abogados, ¿no?, de los litigantes, pero cuando esto está vinculado a la crisis forense, obviamente no tenemos una conciencia, incluso los mismos científicos o expertos forenses, de lo que la prueba forense significa o implica, ¿no?, en términos de las tasas de error, qué tan confiable puede ser, los márgenes de error, pues mucho menos los jueces, mucho menos los abogados y mucho menos se les hace responsables a ellos por este tipo de observaciones que deberían de evidenciar en juicio. Una preparación y una defensa técnica adecuada de una persona que está siendo acusada de un crimen implicaría la revisión de los estándares científicos que necesitan para las pruebas forenses, y esto poca y casi nunca se realiza por parte de los abogadas.
Y bueno, finalmente, despedirnos, la prueba a la que se refiere la maestra Valeria es un caso donde trabajamos el doctor Brent, la maestra Valeria y yo, un caso donde una mujer fue acusada de asesinar a su hija, y un médico forense, por petición del Ministerio Público, de unas moretones que presentaba el cuerpo, sacó unos moldes de puños de las personas sospechosas y agarró ese molde, como veían en el documental, y lo ponían por encima y decían que esos moretones correspondían a los nudillos de una persona y por lo tanto podían determinar no solamente que había sido un golpe, sino que ese golpe correspondía a una persona en particular. Piense usted, para empezar, es una prueba forense que nunca se ha visto en la historia, pero que la estaban haciendo aquí en México, pero esto sucede todo el tiempo. En Tlaxcala hemos visto, por ejemplo, que utilizan grafología. La pseudociencia o las ciencias que parecen, porque se siguen presentando en las universidades como si fueran científicas. Sigues hablando con los dactiloscopistas y siguen hablando de que es completamente confiable. Los que hacen odontología forense hablan de las mordidas, sin tomar en cuenta absolutamente nada de esto. Este es el problema al que nos enfrentamos, y creo que es un problema al cual nos tenemos que despertar, al cual debemos de ser conscientes, y las universidades, en las universidades donde ustedes están, sus maestros, directivos, etcétera, etcétera, tienen que empezar a reconocer que lo que hemos estado haciendo en carreras de criminología, en maestrías de ciencias forenses, donde nosotros trabajamos, es prácticamente repetir estas mentiras. Les agradecemos mucho que nos hayan acompañado en esta presentación. Vamos a tratar de hacerlo cada 15 días. Les vamos a presentar diferentes materiales para que ustedes conozcan más del mundo de la investigación criminal, ciencias forenses, prevención de violencia, etcétera, etcétera. Y pues les agradecemos mucho. Estuvimos con la maestra Valeria Baltazar, con el doctor Brent Turvey. Mi nombre es Aurelio Coronado. Les agradecemos mucho. Nos vemos pronto. Un abrazo.